who would have known that we wouldn't have a government by now? And we may not have one by next Monday. I think possibly one of the sticking points, who gets to be Deputy Prime Minister? And gosh, we've got, look, we're not going to get into the details of this. Just to say that when Marcus Roberts wrote an article for the Maxim Institute, he presumed that we would have a government by now. Marcus, I salute your naivety, your optimism in that regards. Kia ora, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Andrew. I've just lost you, but I'm going to keep talking as if you're still there. I was naively optimistic, but, you know, hope springs eternal.
Yeah, certainly. On the topic of referenda, now we've had a few of these, and looking at it on the surface, you think, oh, this is the finest form of democracy. Everybody gets to have a say, and isn't this a fantastic way of doing government? Well, I'm not sure that's the case, Marcus.
No, I mean, you're right. It has a real intuitive appeal that, you know, democracy is around the will of the people. The trouble is that will is mediated through the government or through the governing parties usually. So why don't we just give it directly to the people to decide on a particular issue? And look, there is something to that, but we have to be aware that referenda have some serious drawbacks. And the paper I was writing was just trying to draw to light some of these drawbacks. And one of them is it's an extremely blunt instrument. Yeah. You are asking pretty much for a yes or no on a issue that people probably aren't aware of a lot of the different nuances or the downstream effects from their answer. And then you have the question of, okay, we've got a referenda result. How do we put that into practice? That's also another huge problem with referenda. You can say, yes, we want to leave the EU, for example, if the UK.
Yep.
How do we go about doing that? Well, we're still a few years down the track, and they're still figuring that out, and the implications of it, at least.
Yeah, for Brexit as perhaps a good example of a bad example, in that a lot of people that voted one way a few years later were going, what on earth did I do? Can I change my mind? Can we have a second referenda? And then that got complicated. In terms of New Zealand's history of referenda, though, it seems to be not so much the will of the people as in who's got the deepest pockets for the biggest lobbying and publicity campaign for the various sides of the cause.
Yeah, that is one of the concerns that people have around referenda, that they are manipulatable by, as you say, deep pockets or people with lots of money. And that is always a problem. I think that's also a concern that we've looked at in terms of the election generally, that, you know, one side with the deeper pockets. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that that's translatable, but it's certainly something to keep aware of. I think the other concern, or not the other concern, but the other thing we've seen in New Zealand is we've had a number of referenda over the years where the will of the people have been very clearly expressed, and has just been ignored by the politicians. I think the greatest example is back in the late 90s, there was a citizens-initiated referenda. So this is where you have to go and get 10% of the electoral roll to sign up. Mm-hmm. And if they do, to a particular question, if they do, then the government has to hold a referendum. And this one was about reducing the number of MPs from 120 to 99. Yeah. And I think 83% of us voted to reduce the number to 99. And for some reason, the MPs just didn't want to vote for an early Christmas. It was very odd. Well, so they never got rid of their numbers.
Very strange indeed. It does happen the other way around, of course, where the government spends millions and millions of dollars trying to convince us that we need a new flag. And
wasn't that two referenda?
It was, and we all chose a flag. I was voting for Laser-Eyed Kiwi. I think that would have been a winner. That would have stood out on the global stage. But then we decided, well, even though this is the one that we picked, we don't want a different flag anyway. I mean, that did seem like a colossal waste of money, really.
Yeah, I mean, that one does. Yeah. I think, though, there is something, referenda being used for more constitutional issues, and I'm not saying that the flag was, but those sort of deeper constitutional issues about where we want to go, or settling a dispute, I think there is some benefit in referendum potentially in those sort of circumstances. That we've had a revolution. We've had a new constitution that's been written. An example, for example, is in Colombia, where they've had a long-running war with communist terror groups. And so they reached a deal, an amnesty deal, and then they put that to the people to say, do you accept this result? So there can be some idea of settling a very deep and thorny political issue through a referendum. And then you can say, well, look, We've been through this. We've thrashed it out in the open. We've had a result, and that therefore we should accept that. And to an extent, I think that's what Brexit was. Even though that people wanted to go back on it, there isn't a feeling, well, we've done this. We've had this referendum. We've had the debate about it. We can't then keep litigating it. Probably the flag was not that example. But I mean, there was another example in the key years of another example where it was ignored, which was the asset sales referendum. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
they were trying to, the key government was going to sell down the government shares in public entities. And there was a citizens initiated referendum where, again, about 60% of us or 2/3 of us said we don't want to do that. And the government said, well, that's just one policy issue. We got voted in on a number of issues. If you don't like it, you can vote us out next time. And we didn't. Yeah. So there are different things. This is one particular issue in a referendum. We do then, is that the most important issue for people when they go into voting, for example? Well, asset sales, it clearly wasn't. So, yeah, generally the piece is they're a blunt instrument.
In some ways, a non-binding referendum is just a very expensive way of doing a poll, really, isn't it? Let's see what the people want. Okay, let's ignore them. I think.
Yeah, also a pressure valve, I think, Andrew,
okay.
that you're saying that actually this is a big issue. Before the early 90s, there was no way of forcing the government to have a expensive poll or a referendum on this particular issue. So you could argue that it's actually, look, there's clearly something in the community. If we can get 10% of people to sign up to this, that's 300,000 signatures. That's no small undertaking. So the idea is that that's a bit of a pressure valve, and you can at least make your wishes known, even if they are ultimately disregarded. So that's the people speaking perhaps to government, not just the government speaking down to the people. So there is, I think, some benefit in that.
David Seymours' proposal, or something certainly that he campaigned on, a referenda on the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, I suspect that this will not survive the negotiations, especially if he wants to be Deputy Prime Minister. However, this is perhaps an example of a referenda which which brings more heat than light. It is such a complicated issue. It just gets everybody's backs up. Willie Jackson was saying we're going to get war in the streets if this referenda goes ahead. Are there some topics which just don't suit referenda, and is this one of them?
Yeah, I think that's right. This referendum proposal from David Seymour brings to light two things. Firstly, he's process-wise, he's trying to insulate himself from the idea that this is too complicated, or we're not sure where to go with this, because what he's proposing is to do the same as they did with the euthanasia law. Pass a law through Parliament, so we all know what it is in black and white that's going to be given effect to, and then we just vote yes or no. So you get around the Brexit problem of not knowing how to give effect to it. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point. The second point, though, I think is a really important one that you've highlighted there, Andrew, is that we have a tension in a democracy between the whole rationale for democracy is that the will of the majority is more has more political force than the will of the minority. Yeah. That if you 50% plus one, your view should prevail because there are more of you. But then how is that in tension? Well, it's in tension with the idea that actually we have to protect some fundamental interests of minorities. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that we will agree to be in a democracy where we sometimes lose, as long as when we lose, we know we're not going to have our fundamental interests taken away by the winning side. Otherwise, why would I participate in democracy? It's a high trust system. You need the trust that your interests won't be taken away. So the question is, with this question, are the fundamental interests of a minority group, in this case Māori, are they being undermined by the will of the majority, and how do we balance that? And so people like Willie Jackson, Jim Bolger, Christopher Luxon even, I think are getting at that point that the will of the majority should not be taking away the rights or fundamental interests of minority groups, in this case Māori. This is what this referendum would do. Now, ACT would have a different view to that, but that, I think, is really the crux of the high feeling around this particular proposal.
The other, of course, complicating factor is that everybody gets a vote in a referenda. That is the nature of democracy. Even those people who aren't particularly well educated and are just reacting from perhaps a doctrinal or even a racist point of view, they're just giving an emotional reaction through referenda rather than saying, no, this is a complicated issue. It's important to who we are foundationally as a people. People who have really studied this and looked into it those are the people we should trust to make decisions on our behalf rather than, well, basically the crapshoot that is referenda sometimes.
Yeah, I think that there is that is, again, I think you've highlighted another tension between the representative democracy, or the elites, for want of a better word, who have the time, the experience, the knowledge to make these decisions on our behalf, versus the people. I think that, though, we vote for the representatives in Parliament, but I think what the Act referendum is getting at is that these principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is what will be up for referendum if it goes there, were not put forward by Parliament. The idea was put forward by Parliament, but actually this is being developed by government agencies who aren't elected, and also by judges who aren't elected. The question then around low information voters, yes, that is a concern. So that's a concern, I think, for all votes. So the question, general elections or referendum. So the question is, how do we get a better educated voter? I think there's a lot of things that we need to think about with that. Civics education might be a good start. Better public discourse. That's why I'm on Rhema, to try and elevate that.
Thank you for
Andrew,
the work you do.
That's why we have these discussions. Exactly.
Hey, well, honestly, if we don't have an actual government by next Monday, maybe we need to have a referenda to say who gets to be Deputy Prime Minister, and we'll sort it out that way. I'm not sure, again, that
the name will be on the ballot, Andrew?
Exactly. No, certainly not putting my hand up for that one. But, hey, a complicated issue. Thank you for your insight on this one. Now, this particular article going to be published on the Maxim website a little bit later in the week. Thank you for the work that you guys do. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Have a great day.